I watched my son walk away from his wife because a doctor told her she couldn't have children, and 3 months later, she sent me a photo that changed everything. I remember the exact way Daniel said it, like he was discussing something practical, something reasonable, not the end of a marriage that had barely begun. We were sitting at the dining table, the same oak table his father had refinished by hand 30 years ago, the one that had seen birthdays and Thanksgiving dinners and quiet Sunday mornings with coffee steaming in mismatched mugs. Emily sat across from him, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her shoulders straight, her face calm in a way that didn't match the words hanging in the air. The doctor confirmed it. Daniel said, not looking at her, not looking at me, just staring somewhere over my shoulder like the decision had already been made long before he spoke it out loud. She can't have kids. I don't want that kind of future. No one moved. The refrigerator hummed in the background. A car passed outside, tires whispering against the pavement. I waited for Emily to say something, to argue, to cry, to defend herself or plead, or even raise her voice just a little, but she didn't. She just nodded once, slow and small, as if she had expected this moment, as if she had already accepted it. I turned to my son, the boy I had raised on my own after his father passed, the boy who used to sit at this same table swinging his legs and asking if we could get a dog, the boy who once promised me he would never leave someone he loved. Daniel, I said quietly, because anything louder felt like it might shatter the fragile stillness. Is that really all this is to you? He exhaled, almost impatiently, and finally looked at me, but there was something missing in his eyes, something I couldn't name at first. Mom, I want a family, he said. A real one. The words landed heavier than they should have. A real one. As if what he had with Emily wasn't real. As if the years they spent building a life together were somehow less because of a sentence spoken in a doctor's office. Emily pushed her chair back slowly, the legs scraping softly against the hardwood floor, and stood up. She didn't rush. She didn't look angry. If anything, she looked composed in a way that made me uneasy. I'll pack tonight, she said, her voice steady, almost gentle, like she was trying to make this easier for him, for me, for everyone. Daniel nodded again, just like before, as if they were agreeing on something ordinary, like rearranging furniture or canceling a reservation. I sat there, my hands resting on the table, feeling the weight of something I couldn't yet understand pressing down on my chest. I had seen marriages end before. I had seen arguments, betrayals, long silences that grew into permanent distance. But this felt different. This felt rehearsed. That night, the house sounded different. Every step echoed a little too loudly. Every drawer closing felt sharper, more final. Emily moved through the hallway with quiet efficiency, folding clothes, placing them into 2 suitcases she had brought with her when she first moved in, back when everything still felt new and hopeful. I stood in the doorway of the guest room, watching her without saying anything for a long time. The lamp cast a soft yellow light across the bed, across the neatly stacked piles of clothes, across her face that gave away almost nothing. You don't have to leave tonight, I finally said. You can stay here as long as you need. She paused for a moment, her hands resting on the edge of the suitcase, then looked up at me with a small, polite smile. Thank you, she said. But I think it's better this way. Better for who? I wanted to ask, but I didn't. Instead, I stepped into the room and sat on the edge of the bed, smoothing my hand over the quilt I had made years ago, the one I gave them when they got married. Did the doctor really say that? I asked, keeping my voice low, careful. Emily's gaze shifted back to the suitcase. That's what we were told, she replied. The way she said it made something inside me tighten. Not what the doctor said. What we were told. It was a small difference, barely noticeable, but it stayed with me. I watched as she zipped the suitcase closed, the sound loud in the quiet room, and lifted it off the bed. I'll call a rideshare in the morning, she added. I don't want to make things more difficult tonight. More difficult. As if anything about this could be simple. Down the hall, I could hear Daniel moving around in the kitchen, opening cabinets, pouring himself a drink, the clink of glass against the counter sharp and out of place. He wasn't helping her pack. He wasn't standing in the doorway, watching, hesitating, second-guessing. He was already moving on. I stayed with Emily until she finished packing, until the suitcases stood by the door like quiet witnesses to something that had ended too quickly, too cleanly. When she finally sat down for a moment, just to rest. I noticed the way her hands trembled ever so slightly before she clasped them together, hiding it. Are you going to be okay? I asked. She looked at me then, really looked at me, and for a second, the calm slipped just enough for me to see something underneath it. Not despair, not even anger, something sharper. I will be, she said. And I believed her, though I didn't understand why. The next morning, the house felt even emptier than it had the night before. Emily's suitcases were gone. Her coffee mug was no longer in the sink. The small pair of shoes she kept by the door had disappeared, leaving a faint outline in the dust where they had been. Daniel sat at the table, scrolling through his phone, his expression neutral, like nothing significant had happened. I poured myself a cup of coffee and sat across from him, studying his face, searching for something, regret, doubt, anything, but finding none. You're really okay with this? I asked. He shrugged, not even looking up. It's for the best, Mom. For the best. I wrapped my hands around the mug, letting the heat seep into my skin, grounding me. Something about the way everything had unfolded felt too smooth, too final, like a story with missing pages. And as I sat there, watching my son move through his morning like any other day, I realized something I couldn't ignore anymore. This wasn't just a decision. It was a plan. And whatever truth had been buried inside that doctor's visit, I had a feeling it hadn't come to the surface yet. I did not cry after she left, and that was the first thing that told me something was wrong. The house settled into a quiet that did not feel like grief, but like something had been removed too cleanly, like a picture taken off a wall that had hung there for years, leaving behind only a faint outline and a few small holes where the nails used to be. I moved through the kitchen slowly that morning, rinsing her coffee mug that she had forgotten in the sink, setting it carefully on the drying rack as if she might come back for it, as if this had all been a misunderstanding that would correct itself by the end of the day. Daniel had already left for work without saying much, just a quick goodbye over his shoulder, the same tone he used on any ordinary morning. That was what unsettled me the most. There was no heaviness in his voice, no hesitation in his steps. He did not look like a man who had just ended a marriage. He looked like a man who had completed a task. I stood by the window for a long time, watching the street, watching neighbors walk their dogs, watching a delivery truck stop 2 houses down, the world moving forward as if nothing significant had happened inside this house. But I could not shake the feeling that I had missed something important, something that had been right in front of me, but had gone unnoticed until it was too late. I replayed the conversation from the night before over and over in my mind, not the words themselves, but the spaces between them. The way Daniel avoided eye contact, the way Emily chose her words carefully, the way she said, "That is what we were told." It was such a small detail, but it refused to leave me alone. By mid-morning, I found myself standing in front of the hallway closet where we kept old paperwork, medical records, insurance documents, things we rarely needed but never threw away. I told myself I was just organizing, just keeping busy, but my hands moved with a purpose I did not fully admit yet. I pulled out a folder labeled with Daniel and Emily's names, flipping through neatly stacked papers until I found the most recent medical reports. I did not understand everything I was reading, but I knew enough to recognize the structure, the signatures, the standard language that doctors used. And yet, something about this report felt off. The conclusion was clear, stated in firm, clinical terms, but the details leading up to it were sparse, almost rushed, as if they had been filled in to support a decision that had already been made. I sat down at the kitchen table again, spreading the papers out in front of me, tracing the lines with my finger, reading the same sentences again and again. It did not make sense. Not entirely. I reached for my phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found the name of my old friend Linda, who had worked as a nurse for over 30 years before retiring. I hesitated for a moment, staring at her name, wondering if I was overthinking this, if grief and shock were making me see problems where there were none. But then I thought about Emily's face, the calmness that did not match the situation, the absence of anger, the absence of pleading, and I pressed the call button. Linda answered on the second ring, her voice warm and familiar, grounding in a way I had not realized I needed. We exchanged a few polite words before I explained, carefully, what had happened, what the doctor had said, what Daniel had decided. There was a pause on the other end of the line, a longer pause than I expected. "Can you send me the report?" she asked finally. "Just a picture of it." I took a photo of the document and sent it to her, then waited, the silence in the house growing heavier with each passing second. When she spoke again, her tone had changed, just slightly, but enough for me to notice. "Margaret," she said slowly, "this is unusual." My grip on the phone tightened. "Unusual how?" Another pause, shorter this time. "I am not saying it is wrong," she continued, careful with her words. "But the way this is written, it is incomplete. There are missing pieces here. Normally, for a conclusion like this, there would be more detailed testing, more documentation." I closed my eyes for a moment, letting her words settle. Missing pieces. That was exactly how it felt. Could it be a mistake? I asked. "It is possible," she replied. "But it is also possible that you are not looking at the full picture." After we ended the call, I sat there for a long time, staring at the report, at the signature at the bottom, at the date. 3 weeks ago. That was when everything had started to change. That was when Daniel had become distant, when Emily had grown quiet, when the house had begun to feel different without any obvious reason. I stood up abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor, and walked to the front door, grabbing my keys from the small ceramic bowl by the entryway. I did not fully know where I was going yet, but I knew I could not sit still anymore, not with this feeling growing stronger by the minute. As I stepped outside, the air felt cooler than I expected, a light breeze brushing against my face, clearing my thoughts just enough for a single idea to take shape. I needed to hear it from the source. I needed to understand exactly what had happened in that doctor's office, not what we were told, but what was actually said. The drive to the clinic took about 15 minutes, a route I had traveled before for routine checkups, for vaccinations, for all the ordinary reasons people visit a place like that. But today, it felt different. Today, it felt like I was driving toward something hidden, something just out of reach that had been carefully placed there for a reason. I parked in the lot, turned off the engine, and sat there for a moment, my hands resting on the steering wheel, steady, calm, despite the thoughts racing through my mind. Then I opened the door and stepped out, closing it behind me with a quiet click that sounded louder than it should have. And as I walked toward the entrance, I realized something that made my steps slow just slightly. If this had been a mistake, it would be corrected easily. But if it was not a mistake, then someone had made sure this happened. And I was about to find out who. I pushed open the glass door of the clinic and stepped into the quiet, controlled calm of the waiting room. The kind of place where everything was designed to feel neutral, clean, reassuring, and yet nothing about it felt that way to me anymore. Not after what had happened, not after the words that had ended a marriage in a single sentence. The receptionist looked up with a practiced smile, her fingers still resting on the keyboard, as if she had paused mid-typing just for me. I returned a polite nod, the kind you give out of habit, and approached the counter with a steadiness I did not quite feel inside. "Good morning," I said, keeping my voice even. "I am here to ask about a recent report. My daughter-in-law, Emily Carter, was seen here a few weeks ago." The receptionist's expression shifted slightly, not enough for most people to notice, but enough for me. "Are you listed on her account?" she asked. I expected that. "No," I replied, "but I have some concerns about the information she was given, and I would like to speak with someone who can clarify the results." She hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "Please have a seat. I will see if a nurse is available." I turned and walked to the row of chairs by the window, sitting down slowly, my hands resting in my lap, my eyes tracing the lines of the floor tiles as if they might offer some kind of answer. People came and went, called back by name, disappearing behind closed doors, their concerns handled in private rooms I could not see. I waited. 10 minutes. 15. Time moved differently in places like this, stretched thin between uncertainty and routine. Finally, a woman in light blue scrubs stepped into the waiting area and called my name. "Mrs. Collins?" she said, her voice calm, professional. I stood and followed her down a hallway that smelled faintly of antiseptic and something floral, a scent meant to soften the edges of the place. She led me into a small consultation room and closed the door behind us. "I understand you have questions about a recent visit," she said, taking a seat across from me. I nodded, placing the folded copy of the report on the table between us. "This is what my son and his wife were given," I said. "I would like to understand how this conclusion was reached." She picked up the paper and scanned it quickly, her eyes moving with familiarity across the lines. At first, her expression remained neutral, But then something shifted, just a fraction, a tightening around the eyes, a pause that lasted half a second longer than it should have. She looked up at me. "Who provided you with this copy?" she asked. The question caught me off guard, not because it was difficult, but because of the way she asked it. "My son had it," I said. "Why?" She placed the paper back on the table carefully, aligning it with the edge as if precision mattered more than anything else in that moment. "This does not look like a finalized report," she said slowly. "There are sections missing. Normally, this type of diagnosis would include more detailed documentation." I felt a quiet confirmation settle inside me. Not relief, not yet, but recognition. "So you are saying this is incomplete?" I said. She nodded. "Yes. And without the full documentation, it would be inappropriate to draw a definitive conclusion." I leaned back slightly in my chair, letting that sink in. Inappropriate to draw a conclusion. And yet, a conclusion had been drawn. A life had been altered. A marriage had ended. "Can you access her full file?" I asked. The nurse hesitated, her fingers resting lightly on the edge of the table. "I can check the system," she said finally. "Please wait here." She left the room, the door closing softly behind her, and I was alone again, the silence pressing in around me. Thicker now, heavier with the weight of what might come next. I looked down at my hands, noticing how still they were, how calm I appeared from the outside, even as my thoughts moved quickly, connecting pieces, forming a picture that was not yet complete, but already unsettling. When the nurse returned, she carried a tablet, her expression more serious than before. She sat down and tapped a few times on the screen before turning it slightly toward me. "This is the record from that visit," she said. I leaned forward, scanning the information, the dates, the test results, the notes entered by the attending physician. It was all there, detailed, thorough, nothing like the document I had been given. And at the bottom, under the final assessment, there was a statement that made my breath catch, just for a second. The findings were inconclusive. Further testing recommended. I blinked, reading it again to make sure I had not misunderstood. Inconclusive. Not definitive. Not final. My eyes moved back to the nurse. "This is not what they were told," I said quietly. She shook her head. "According to this record, no definitive diagnosis was made at that time." I sat back, the room suddenly feeling smaller, the air a little heavier. "Is it possible that a different version of the report was created?" I asked. She frowned slightly, considering the question. "All official reports are generated through our system," she said. "They are signed and finalized by the attending physician. It would be unusual for a patient to receive a document that does not match what is in the system." Unusual. That word again. Everything about this was unusual. I looked down at the paper on the table, at the signature printed at the bottom, at the date. Then I looked back at the tablet, at the digital signature on the official record. They were not the same. The difference was subtle, the kind of thing most people would never notice, but once seen, it could not be ignored. I felt something settle into place inside me, a quiet, cold clarity. This had not been a misunderstanding. It had not been a rushed conclusion or a miscommunication. It had been something else entirely. Something deliberate. "Thank you," I said, my voice steady as I stood up. "You have been very helpful." She nodded, though her expression suggested she knew there was more to this than I was saying. I walked out of the clinic the same way I had walked in, calm, measured, each step controlled, but inside, everything had shifted. The story I had been given no longer held together. And as I reached my car and placed my hand on the door handle, I realized something that made my grip tighten just slightly. If the report had been altered, then someone had needed it to be altered. And there were only a few people who had access, a few people who stood to benefit from it. I sat in the driver's seat, staring straight ahead for a moment, the engine still off, the world outside moving as usual, unaware of the quiet unraveling taking place inside this small space. Then I reached for my phone, already knowing who I needed to call next, and more importantly, who I needed to watch much more carefully from now on. I did not start the car right away. I just sat there with my phone in my hand and the engine silent, letting the truth settle into something solid enough to act on. Because once you understand that something was done on purpose, you cannot go back to pretending it was an accident, and I was not interested in pretending anymore. I scrolled through my contacts slowly, stopping on Daniel's name, then moving past it, because this was not a conversation I could have yet, not without knowing more, not without understanding how deep this went, and more importantly, why. Instead, I pressed on Emily's name, my thumb hovering for just a second before I called. It rang longer than I expected, each second stretching thin, until finally she answered. Margaret. Her voice was quiet, cautious, like she had been expecting something but was not sure what. It is me, I said, keeping my tone even, steady. Are you somewhere you can talk? There was a brief pause, the sound of movement on her end, a door closing perhaps. Yes, she said. I am at my apartment. I closed my eyes for a moment, picturing her there, alone in a space that was never supposed to be temporary, never supposed to be hers alone. I went to the clinic today, I said. Silence. Not confusion. Not surprise. Just silence. And? She asked finally. I leaned back in the seat, looking out through the windshield at nothing in particular. The report you were given, I said slowly, was not complete. The official record says the results were inconclusive. There was no final diagnosis. This time, the silence felt different. Heavier. I know, she said quietly. The words did not hit me like a shock. They settled instead, like a piece of a puzzle finally clicking into place where it had been missing all along. You knew. I repeated, not as a question, but as a confirmation. Yes, she said. I found out a week after the appointment. I tightened my grip on the phone just slightly. Why did you not say anything? Another pause, longer this time. And when she spoke again, there was something in her voice that had not been there before, something restrained, something held back. Because I wanted to see how far he would go, she said. I opened my eyes fully then, focusing on the empty parking lot in front of me. Explain that to me, I said. I heard her take a breath on the other end, slow and controlled. After the appointment, Daniel was the one who picked up the paperwork, she began. I was still in the room when the nurse mentioned that more tests would be needed. Nothing was final. But when he came back with the report, it said something else entirely. I listened without interrupting, each word adding weight to what I had already suspected. At first, I thought it was a mistake, she continued. But then I noticed how quickly he accepted it. No questions. No hesitation. It was like he had been waiting for it. Waiting for it. The phrase echoed in my mind. So you stayed quiet, I said. Yes, she replied. I wanted to know if he would question it, if he would try to understand, if he would stand by me even for a moment. But he did not. I closed my eyes again, the image of my son at the table replaying in my mind, his calm expression, his steady voice, his complete lack of doubt. He made his decision immediately, she added, her voice steady but thinner now, like something underneath it was being held in place by sheer will. That told me everything I needed to know. I let out a slow breath, the kind that comes when something you hoped was not true becomes undeniable. Emily, I said carefully, there is something else you need to tell me. She did not respond right away, but I could hear it in the silence, the shift, the hesitation that comes when a truth is waiting just beneath the surface. The photo you sent me, I continued. You said you were pregnant. This time, there was no hesitation. I am, she said. I felt my heart beat once, hard and deliberate, then settle into a slower rhythm. And Daniel does not know, I said. No, she replied. He does not. I looked down at my hands, still steady, still calm, even as everything continued to rearrange itself around this new reality. When did you find out? I asked. 2 weeks ago, she said. After I moved out. 2 weeks. That meant she had known when she called me, when she sent the photo, when she chose to reveal it. Why tell me? I asked. Because you deserve to know the truth, she said simply. And because I think you are the only one who will actually see it for what it is. I let that sit between us for a moment, the weight of it settling into something solid. And what is it? I asked quietly. There was a faint sound on her end, like she had shifted her position, like she was preparing herself to say something that mattered. It is not about me not being able to have children, she said. It never was. I felt something cold move through me, not fear, not shock, but clarity sharpening into something precise. Then what is it about? I asked. Another pause, shorter this time, more deliberate. You should ask Daniel, she said. I almost smiled at that, not because it was amusing, but because it confirmed what I already knew. This was not something he would tell me willingly. This was something that would have to be uncovered. I will, I said. But not yet. What are you going to do? She asked. I looked out at the parking lot again, at the ordinary world continuing without interruption, unaware of the quiet unraveling happening just beneath the surface. I am going to watch, I said, and I am going to listen. There was a small shift in her breathing, something like understanding. He thinks this is over, I added. He thinks he has already moved on. He does, she said softly. I nodded, even though she could not see it. Then we will let him think that, I said. And as I ended the call and finally started the car, I realized something that settled into place with a kind of quiet certainty. This was not just about a false report or a broken marriage anymore. This was about a decision my son had made long before that night at the table, a decision that had required planning, timing, and a reason strong enough to justify everything that followed. And whatever that reason was, I was going to find it, even if it meant seeing him more clearly than I ever had before. That evening, I set the table for two like nothing had changed, like this was just another ordinary night in a house that had not quietly fallen apart a few days earlier, and when Daniel walked in, he did not seem surprised to see dinner waiting for him, which told me something else I needed to know. He was not expecting questions, not expecting resistance, not expecting anything at all. He loosened his tie as he stepped into the kitchen, glancing briefly at the plates, the glasses, the food I had prepared, and for a moment, I watched him. The way you watch a stranger, looking for familiarity and not quite finding it. You did not have to cook, he said casually, setting his keys down in the ceramic bowl by the door, the same bowl that had held them every day for years. I wanted to, I replied, keeping my voice even, controlled, the way I had learned to speak when emotions threatened to surface too quickly. He nodded and pulled out his chair, sitting down without hesitation, without that slight pause people usually have when something important is hanging unspoken in the air. That absence told me more than any words could have. I sat across from him, folding my hands lightly on the table, watching as he served himself, as if this were just another evening, as if nothing significant had happened, as if a marriage had not ended in this very room. How was work? I asked, not because I needed to know, but because I needed to hear how he answered. Busy, he said. We are closing a deal this week. His tone was steady, focused, already moving forward, already invested in something else. I nodded once, letting a small silence settle between us before speaking again. You seem certain about your decision, I said carefully. He glanced up at me briefly, then back down at his plate. I am, he replied. No hesitation. No doubt. I studied his face, the calmness, the lack of tension, and I realized something that settled into place with a quiet certainty. He was not reacting. He was continuing. You did not ask for a second opinion, I said. It was not a question. He paused then, just for a fraction of a second, the fork in his hand hovering slightly above the plate before continuing. There was no point, he said. The result was clear. I felt something shift inside me, not surprise, not anymore, but confirmation. That is interesting, I said, my voice still calm, still measured. Because I spoke to someone today who said the report was not complete. This time, he looked up, really looked at me, and in that brief moment, I saw it. Not fear exactly, but awareness, a recognition that something had moved out of his control. It disappeared almost immediately, replaced by the same composed expression he had worn all evening. Who did you talk to? He asked. A nurse. At the clinic, I replied. She showed me the official record. He leaned back slightly in his chair, setting his fork down, his movements deliberate, controlled. Mom, he said, choosing his words carefully. You should not be involving yourself in this. It was between me and Emily. I held his gaze, not raising my voice, not pushing, just watching. And yet, I am involved, I said quietly. Because you made this decision in my home, at my table, and expected me to accept it without question. He exhaled slowly, a small sign of irritation slipping through the surface. There is nothing to question, he said. It would not have worked. Would not have worked. The simplicity of it, the finality, as if a person, a life, a future could be reduced to something so easily dismissed. Did you love her? I asked. The question landed between us, heavier than anything else I had said. He did not answer right away, and in that silence, I found something more revealing than any immediate response. I did, he said finally. Past tense. I nodded once, absorbing it, placing it where it belonged. And now? I asked. He looked at me, his expression steady again, composed. Now I am moving forward, he said. I let that sit for a moment, then reached for my glass, taking a small sip of water, giving him just enough time to believe the conversation might end there. It did not. Emily is pregnant, I said. The words were quiet, but they cut through the space between us with a clarity that could not be ignored. He froze. Not dramatically, not obviously, but enough. His hands stilled on the table, his eyes fixed on me, searching, calculating. That is not possible, he said. I watched him closely, every detail, every micro-expression, every shift in posture. That is what the report said, I replied. But we have already established that the report was not accurate. He leaned back further, crossing his arms now, a defensive posture, subtle but unmistakable. If she told you that, she is mistaken, he said. His voice was controlled, but there was something underneath it now, something tighter. She did not tell me, I said. She showed me. Silence. Longer this time. He looked away first, his gaze drifting toward the window, toward anything that was not me. Even if that were true, he said slowly, it does not change anything. I felt the weight of that statement settle into the room, heavier than anything else that had been said. It does not change anything. I repeated, my voice calm, almost neutral. No, he said. I studied him for a moment longer, then nodded, as if accepting his answer, as if this were the end of the discussion. All right, I said softly. He seemed to relax slightly at that, just enough for me to notice. But I was not finished. Not even close. I stood up from the table, gathering my plate, moving toward the sink with the same steady rhythm I had maintained all evening. You should get some rest, I added over my shoulder. You have a busy week ahead. I do, he said, his voice returning to its earlier calm. I rinsed the plate under warm water, watching the stream flow over the surface, clear and continuous, washing away what remained of the meal. Behind me, I heard him stand, the chair sliding back, his footsteps moving toward the hallway. Good night, Mom, he said. Good night, Daniel, I replied. I waited until I heard his bedroom door close before turning off the faucet and setting the plate in the rack. The kitchen fell silent again, the kind of silence that no longer felt empty, but full, filled with everything that had been said and everything that had not. I dried my hands slowly, methodically, then placed the towel back on its hook, exactly where it belonged. And as I stood there, looking at the reflection of the room in the dark window, I understood something with absolute clarity. He was not surprised that Emily might be pregnant. He was surprised that I knew. And that meant there was still something he was hiding, something he had not prepared for me to discover. I did not need to confront him again tonight. I did not need to push harder or demand answers. I only needed to wait, to watch, and to let him believe that he was still in control. Because people reveal the most when they think they have already won. And Daniel, for the first time in his life, was about to learn how wrong that belief could be. The next morning, I woke before the sun had fully risen, not because I had somewhere to be, but because my mind had already begun moving long before my body had the chance to rest. And when I walked into the kitchen, the house felt the same as it had the night before, quiet, still, but no longer empty. Now it felt like a place holding something just beneath the surface, something waiting. I made coffee the same way I always did, measuring the grounds, pouring the water, listening to the slow, steady drip as it filled the pot, the routine grounding me, giving my hands something to do while my thoughts arranged themselves into something more deliberate. Daniel left early again, earlier than usual, with a quick goodbye that did not invite conversation, and I watched him from the window as he got into his car, his movements efficient, focused, like a man who had already planned the rest of his day down to the minute. That was when I noticed it, not something obvious, not something anyone else would have questioned, but a small shift, a change in pattern. He checked his phone before starting the engine, not once, but twice, his expression tightening for just a second before smoothing out again. Then he drove off. I stood there for a moment longer, letting that detail settle into place with everything else I had already gathered. Patterns do not change without reason. After he left, I did not sit down. I did not turn on the television or open a book. Instead, I moved through the house slowly, not searching in the way someone does when they are desperate for answers, but observing, noticing, paying attention to the things that had always been there, but had never needed to be questioned before. His jacket was draped over the back of the chair in the living room, one sleeve slightly folded inward, something he never did. His briefcase was by the door, but not fully closed, the zipper left open by an inch, as if he had been in a hurry. Small things, insignificant on their own, but together, they formed something else. I walked over and rested my hand lightly on the briefcase, not opening it yet, just feeling the weight of it, the presence of whatever was inside. For a moment, I hesitated. Not because I was unsure, but because I understood that once I looked, I would be crossing a line that could not be undone. Then, I unzipped it the rest of the way. Inside, everything was neatly arranged, documents stacked, a tablet secured in its case, a pen placed exactly where it should be. But there, tucked between two folders, was something out of place, a small envelope, unsealed, with no name written on the front. I pulled it out slowly, turning it over in my hands before opening it. Inside was a single sheet of paper, a printed email. I recognized the format immediately, the spacing, the structure, but it was the names that made my breath slow, steady, deliberate. Daniel Collins. And another name I had never seen before. I read it once, then again, each word settling into place with a quiet precision that left no room for doubt. The message was brief, direct, not written with emotion, but with intention. It referenced timing. It referenced documents. It referenced making sure that everything was handled before a certain date. There was no mention of Emily, no mention of a diagnosis, but there did not need to be. The implication was clear. This had been planned. Not in a moment. Not in reaction. But carefully, step by step. I folded the paper back along its original crease and slid it into the envelope, placing it exactly where I had found it, my movements slow, controlled, leaving no trace that it had been touched. Then I closed the briefcase, aligning the zipper the way it had been, restoring the scene to what it had been before I arrived. I stood there for a moment, looking at it, at the quiet normalcy of it all, and I felt something shift inside me. Not anger, not yet, but something colder, something steadier. This was no longer about suspicion. This was confirmation. I walked back into the kitchen and poured myself a cup of coffee, taking a slow sip as I leaned against the counter, letting the warmth spread through me, grounding me in the present. Then I reached for my phone and opened my messages, scrolling to Emily's name. I did not call this time. I typed. I found something. We need to talk in person. There was no immediate response, and I did not expect one. Instead, I set the phone down and looked out the window again, watching as the morning continued to unfold, as people moved through their routines, unaware of the quiet. Unraveling taking place behind closed doors. About 10 minutes later, my phone lit up. Where? I picked it up and typed back without hesitation. A small cafe on Maple Street. 1 o'clock. I waited a second, then added, I think I know why he did it. The response came almost immediately this time. I will be there. I set the phone down again and finished my coffee, my mind already moving ahead, already preparing, not for confrontation, but for clarity. Because whatever Daniel had set in motion, whatever he believed was already settled, was about to be seen in a way he had not anticipated. And as I rinsed my cup and placed it in the sink, I realized something that settled into place with a quiet certainty. He had assumed that no one would look closely. He had assumed that the story he created would be enough. But stories only hold when no one questions them. And I was no longer willing to accept anything at face value. I arrived at the cafe 10 minutes early, choosing a table near the window where I could see the street clearly, where nothing could approach without being noticed. And as I sat there with my hands wrapped around a cup of tea that had already begun to cool, I realized that this was no longer just a conversation between two people trying to understand what had happened. This was the moment where everything would begin to take shape in a way that could not be undone. Emily walked in exactly at 1 o'clock, her movements calm, measured, her posture straight in a way that reminded me of the night she packed her suitcases, composed on the outside, controlled, but carrying something beneath it that did not show unless you knew where to look. She saw me immediately and walked over without hesitation, taking the seat across from me, placing her bag gently on the floor beside her chair. You said you found something, she said, her voice low, direct, without unnecessary words. I nodded once, studying her face, noticing the subtle changes since the last time I had seen her, the slight tiredness around her eyes, the way she held her hands together just a little tighter than before. I did, I replied, and I think it explains more than the report ever could. She did not interrupt. She did not. Asked me to clarify. She simply waited. I reached into my purse and took out a small notepad where I had written down the details from the email I found. Not the paper itself, but enough to reconstruct what mattered. There was an email, I said. Printed. Hidden in Daniel's briefcase. Her expression did not change immediately, but I saw it in the slight shift of her gaze, the way her focus sharpened just a fraction. What kind of email? She asked. The kind that does not exist unless someone wants to make sure something happens, I said. It mentioned timing, documents, and making sure everything was finalized before a certain date. She leaned back slightly, her fingers tightening together for a moment before relaxing again. What date? She asked. I looked down at my notes, though I already knew the answer. 2 weeks ago, I said. The same week you moved out. Silence settled between us, not empty, but full, heavy with the weight of what that meant. Emily looked out the window briefly, her eyes unfocused for just a second, then returned to me. That was when I found out I was pregnant, she said. I nodded slowly. I thought so. She exhaled quietly, a controlled release, like someone letting go of something they had been holding in place for too long. He knew, she said. Not a question, a realization. I did not answer right away, not because I doubted it, but because I wanted to be precise. I do not know when he knew, I said carefully. But I know he was planning something before that report was ever finalized. She looked down at the table, her fingers tracing the edge of her cup without lifting it. He was different before the appointment, she said. More distant. More careful. Careful. The word fit too well. And after? I asked. After, it was like everything was already decided, she replied. Like he was just waiting for the right moment to say it out loud. I watched her as she spoke, noticing the way her voice remained steady, the way she did not let it break, not even slightly, and I understood then that whatever she had felt when this first happened, she had already moved past it, already processed it in a way that allowed her to sit here now, calm, composed, ready to see the truth. Clearly, there is something else, I said. She looked up immediately. The signature on the report, I continued. It does not match the official record. Her eyes narrowed slightly, not in confusion, but in focus. You are saying it was altered, she said. Yes, I replied, and not carelessly. She leaned forward now, her attention fully on me. Then someone had to do it intentionally, she said. I held her gaze. Exactly. We sat there for a moment, the noise of the cafe around us fading into the background, conversations blending into a low hum that no longer mattered. There is one more thing, I added. The email was not just about the report. It was about making sure everything was handled before a specific outcome. She did not speak, but I could see the thought forming, the connection being made. Before what? She asked quietly. I let the silence stretch just long enough for the answer to settle on its own. Before you found out you were pregnant, I said. She closed her eyes briefly, just for a second, then opened them again, her expression unchanged, but something deeper had shifted, something that moved from uncertainty into clarity. So he needed the diagnosis to be final before that happened, she said. Yes. Because if I was pregnant, she continued, then he would not have a reason to leave. I nodded once. Not one that would hold up, I said. She leaned back again, her shoulders relaxing slightly, not in relief, but in acceptance of something that could no longer be denied. So it was not about me, she said. It was about timing. And control, I added. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. He wanted everything to happen on his terms, she said. He wanted a clean break. No questions. No complications. I looked at her for a moment longer, then spoke the thought that had been forming since I read that email. And he did not expect you to find out the truth, I said. Not about the report. Not about the pregnancy. She met my gaze, steady, unwavering. He underestimated me, she said. I allowed myself the smallest hint of a smile, not because the situation was amusing, but because that statement carried a weight that went beyond the moment we were in. He underestimated both of us, I replied. We sat there in silence for a moment, the kind that no longer needed to be filled with words, because everything that mattered had already been said. Then Emily reached for her cup, taking a small sip before setting it back down. What are you going to do? She asked. I looked out the window again, watching as a car passed slowly, sunlight reflecting off the windshield in a brief flash of brightness. Nothing, I said. She frowned slightly. Nothing. I turned back to her, my expression calm, my voice steady. Not yet, I clarified. Because right now, he believes everything is exactly the way he planned it. She studied me for a moment, then nodded slowly, understanding settling in. And you are going to let him keep believing that, she said. Yes, I replied. For as long as he needs to. I reached for my tea, now lukewarm, and took a slow sip, letting the taste settle before continuing. Because the more comfortable he becomes, I said quietly, the more he will reveal. Emily did not respond immediately, but I saw it in her eyes, the shift from reaction to intention, from processing to preparation. And when he does? She asked. I set the cup down carefully, aligning it with the edge of the table, my movements precise, controlled. Then we will be ready, I said. After we left the cafe, I did not rush home, and I did not call Daniel, and I did not change anything about the way I moved through the rest of that day, because the most important part of what we had just decided was not what we would do, but what we would not do, and that was reveal that we knew the truth. When I walked back into the house, everything looked exactly the same as it had that morning. The same chair slightly pulled out, the same faint crease in the couch cushion where he usually sat, the same quiet stillness that had once felt empty, but now felt like a stage waiting for something to unfold. I placed my purse on the table, took off my coat, and moved into the kitchen with the same steady rhythm I had always had, as if nothing had changed, as if I had not just confirmed that my son had built a plan around deception and timing. I made dinner again that night, not because I needed to, but because routine has a way of keeping everything in place, and people rarely question what feels familiar. Daniel came home at his usual time, his steps measured, his expression composed, and when he saw me at the stove, he gave a small nod, the same one he had given the night before, the same one he had likely given many times without thinking. Smells good, he said. I smiled slightly, not too much, just enough. It is something simple, I replied. He set his briefcase down in the same spot, his jacket over the same chair, and for a moment, I watched him from the corner of my eye, noting every movement, every small detail that might have seemed ordinary before, but now carried meaning. He did not check his phone immediately this time, which told me something had shifted, not drastically, but enough to be noticed. He was being careful. We sat down to eat, and the conversation was light, surface level, the kind of exchange people have when there is nothing they want to discuss, when the real subject is being avoided on purpose. I asked about his work again, and he answered in the same steady tone, describing meetings, timelines, numbers, all the things that made up a life that continued forward without interruption. I listened, nodding occasionally, asking just enough questions to keep the rhythm natural, to give him no reason to suspect that anything had changed. I might be traveling next week, he said at one point, cutting into his food with precise movements. Just for a couple of days. I looked up at him, keeping my expression neutral. For work? I asked. Yes, he said. We are finalizing some things in person. Finalizing. The words settled into place alongside everything else. That sounds important, I said. He nodded. It is. There was a brief pause, just long enough for him to consider whether to say more. Then he continued eating, the moment passing without further explanation. I did not press. I did not ask where he was going or who he would be meeting. Not yet. After dinner, he cleared his plate, something he had not done the night before, and placed it in the sink with a quiet clink. I have a call to take, he said, already moving toward the hallway. Of course, I replied. I waited until his door closed. Before moving slowly to the sink, rinsing the dishes, listening to the faint murmur of his voice through the wall, too quiet to make out words, but present enough to confirm that he was not alone in this, that there were conversations happening just out of reach, connections I had only begun to see. I dried my hands and stepped into the living room, sitting down in the chair across from where his briefcase rested, my eyes settling on it without moving any closer. I did not need to open it again, not tonight. I already knew enough. Instead, I reached for my phone and opened my messages, scrolling to Emily's name. He is traveling next week. There was a short pause before her reply appeared. Where? I set the phone down for a moment, considering, then typed back. He did not say, but it matters. The response came quickly. It does. I leaned back in my chair, my gaze drifting toward the hallway, toward the closed door behind which my son continued speaking in a voice I could not hear clearly. He is getting ready to move on completely. Emily had said earlier, and now I could see it. Not just in his words, but in the way he carried himself, in the way he had already shifted his focus to something ahead, something planned. I picked up my phone again. We need to know who he is meeting. This time, the pause was longer. Then, I can find out. I read the message twice, then typed back. Be careful. I set the phone aside and folded my hands in my lap. The room quiet around me. The kind of quiet that no longer felt passive, but active, as if it were holding space for what was coming next. A few minutes later, Daniel's door opened, and he stepped back into the hallway, his expression neutral, composed, as if the conversation he had just finished had not changed anything. I'm going to get some sleep, he said. Early morning tomorrow. I nodded. Of course, I replied. He hesitated for just a fraction of a second, then added, Everything is fine, Mom. You do not need to worry. I met his gaze, holding it just long enough to make the moment real, then gave a small, calm nod. I am not worried, I said. He seemed to accept that. Or at least he chose to, and turned away, walking down the hallway, his steps steady, his posture unchanged. I waited until I heard his door close again before letting my expression settle back into stillness. Because worry was not what I felt anymore. What I felt was clarity. And as I sat there in the dim light of the living room, I understood something with absolute certainty. He believed that everything was under control, that every piece had been placed exactly where it needed to be, that the story he had created would carry him forward without resistance. But he had not accounted for one thing. He had not accounted for someone looking closely enough to see the gaps. And now that those gaps had been found, it was only a matter of time before the entire structure began to shift. The next 2 days passed without anything dramatic happening on the surface, and that was exactly what made them important, because when nothing appears to change, people tend to relax, and when they relax, they stop guarding the details that matter most. I kept my routine steady, waking at the same time, making coffee the same way, moving through the house with the same quiet rhythm I had always had, and Daniel responded to that consistency without question, as if the world had returned to normal, as if the conversation we had about Emily, about the pregnancy, about the report, had already faded into something insignificant. But I watched him more closely now, not in an obvious way, not in a way that would make him aware, but in the small moments that most people overlook, the pauses between actions, the subtle shifts in attention. On the second evening, he stayed later at work than usual, or at least that was what he said, and when he finally walked through the door, there was a faint tension in his posture that had not been there before, something restrained, something controlled. Long day, he said, placing his briefcase down more carefully than usual. I nodded, not asking for details. Dinner is in the oven, I replied. He thanked me, his tone polite, almost distant, and moved through the kitchen with a precision that felt rehearsed, like he was following a pattern he had already set in motion. As we ate, the conversation remained light, but there was an undercurrent. Now, something neither of us acknowledged directly, but both of us could feel. He checked his phone once during dinner, just briefly, his eyes scanning the screen before placing it face down beside his plate. That was new. Before, he had been more open, less cautious. Now he was adjusting. After dinner, he did not go straight to his room. Instead, he lingered in the living room, standing near the window, his phone in his hand, his back partially turned to me. I stayed in the kitchen, drying dishes slowly, giving him space, letting him believe he was unobserved. A few minutes later, he stepped outside onto the front porch, closing the door behind him just enough to muffle his voice. I did not follow. I did not move closer. I simply stood there, listening to the faint rhythm of his speech, the rise and fall of his tone, not the words themselves, but the pattern. It was not a work call. That much was clear. There was a softness in his voice that did not belong to business, a familiarity that suggested something else entirely. When he came back inside, he slipped his phone into his pocket quickly, as if the action itself might go unnoticed. Everything okay? I asked, keeping my tone casual. Yes, he said immediately. Too quickly. I nodded and turned back to the sink, letting the moment pass without pressure. That night, after he went to bed, I sat in the living room again, the house quiet, the lights dim, my thoughts moving steadily through everything I had seen, everything I had heard, everything that had begun to form into something more complete. I reached for my phone and opened my messages. Emily had not written again since earlier, and I did not send anything new. Not yet. Instead, I opened the notes I had been keeping, the small details, the patterns, the changes, and I added one more line. Evening call. Not work. Tone different. Then I set the phone down and leaned back in my chair, closing my eyes for just a moment, letting the pieces settle. The next morning, Daniel left even earlier than before the sun had fully risen, his movements quiet, almost careful, as if he did not want to wake me, though I was already awake, standing in the hallway, watching from the shadowed edge where he could not see me. He paused by the door, checking his phone again, his expression tightening briefly before smoothing out, and then he left. I waited until I heard his car pull away before stepping fully into the light, the house once again settling into silence. I moved through the kitchen, making coffee, but my mind was already focused on the next step, not a confrontation, not yet, but something more precise. At noon, my phone buzzed softly against the table. It was Emily. I found out who he is meeting. I picked up the phone immediately, my attention sharpening. Who? There was a pause, longer than usual, and then her reply appeared. Her name is Laura Bennett. I read the message once, then again, letting the name settle into place. Unfamiliar, but significant. Do you know her? I typed. Yes, Emily replied. She works at his company. That was enough. Not proof, not yet, but direction. I set the phone down slowly, my gaze drifting toward the window, toward the quiet street outside, the same street that had not changed, even as everything else had. A colleague. Someone close enough to be part of his daily life, someone accessible, someone who would not raise suspicion if mentioned casually. I picked up my phone again. Do you know if they are traveling together? The response came quickly this time. I am not sure, but I think so. I nodded slightly, even though she could not see it. That fits, I typed. I set the phone down once more, my thoughts moving through the new information, aligning it with everything else. The altered report. The timing. The email. The distance. The calls. It was no longer a question of whether something had been planned. It was a question of how far it went. And as I stood there, the coffee cooling in my cup, the house quiet around me, I understood something that settled into place with absolute clarity. This was not just about leaving a marriage. This was about replacing it. And the way he had done it, the way he had structured it, meant that he believed no one would ever see the full picture. But now we were looking at it from the outside, piece by piece, and the image was beginning to form, clearer with each detail. And once a picture becomes clear enough, it cannot be ignored. De la tuda matwa muon lam noi dung video YouTube. Hey Zaknan li tuda. My parents left me at a random train station as a joke. Let's see how she finds her way home. Thursday morning arrived with a stillness that felt almost deliberate, as if the day itself understood what it was about to reveal and chose to move more slowly because of it. And I followed my routine exactly as I had every day before, making coffee, opening the curtains, letting the light fill the room in the same quiet way it always did. Because nothing on the surface could change if I wanted everything beneath it to come into focus clearly. Daniel left just after 7, his suitcase small, efficient, the kind people use when they intend to travel light and without complication, and he moved through the house with the same calm precision he had shown all week, checking his phone once, then again, before placing it in his pocket. I will call when I arrive, he said. I nodded, offering the same response as before. Drive safe. He paused for a moment, just a fraction longer than necessary, as if considering whether there was something else he should say, then turned and walked out the door, closing it quietly behind him. I waited until I heard the car pull away before exhaling slowly, not out of relief, but out of readiness. This was no longer about watching from a distance. This was the moment where everything would either confirm what we already knew or reveal something we had not yet seen. My phone buzzed softly on the table. It was Emily. I have it. I picked it up immediately. Where? There was no delay this time. The Grand Elm Hotel. Downtown. Room reservation under his name. 2 guests. I read the message once, then again, letting the details settle into place with a clarity that left no room for doubt. 2 guests. Not business. Not work. Not anything he had said. I typed back. I am on my way. The drive into the city took just over 30 minutes. Traffic light at that hour, the roads open in a way that felt almost intentional, as if nothing stood in the way of what needed to happen. I did not rush. I did not speed. I kept my hand steady on the wheel, my breathing even, my thoughts focused not on emotion, but on observation, on what I needed to see, what I needed to confirm. When I arrived, Emily was already there, standing near the entrance, her posture straight, her expression calm, though I could see the tension held carefully beneath it. She looked at me as I stepped out of the car, and for a moment, we said nothing, because words were no longer necessary. Everything we needed to say had already been understood. He checked in 20 minutes ago, she said quietly as we walked toward the entrance together. I nodded once. And her? I asked. 5 minutes after him, she replied. The timing was precise, controlled, planned. We stepped inside, the lobby quiet, polished, the kind of place where people come and go without drawing attention, where privacy is expected and questions are rarely asked. I did not go to the front desk. I did not speak to anyone. Instead, I moved toward the seating area near the elevators, choosing a place where we could see without being seen, where we could wait without being noticed. We sat down, side by side, our focus directed toward the hallway leading to the elevator bank. Time moved slowly, each second stretching, not with uncertainty, but with anticipation. Then, the elevator doors opened. Daniel stepped out first, his posture relaxed, his expression composed, exactly the way it had been all week, exactly the way it had been at the dinner table, as if nothing in his world had been disrupted. And beside him was a woman I did not recognize in person, but I knew her immediately from the name, from the pieces we had put together, from the shape of the story that had been forming. Laura Bennett. She walked beside him with an ease that did not come from coincidence, her movements familiar, comfortable, as if this was not new, as if this had been part of his life long before anything had changed at home. They spoke quietly to each other, their expressions soft, unguarded, nothing like the careful control Daniel had shown with me. This was different. This was real. I felt Emily shift slightly beside me, but she did not move. She did not react outwardly. She simply watched, the same way I did, with clarity, with certainty. Daniel reached out briefly, placing his hand at the small of Laura's back as they walked. A small gesture, but one that carried more meaning than anything else we had seen. It was not hesitation. It was not uncertainty. It was familiarity. They passed by without noticing us, their attention focused on each other, on whatever conversation they were having, on the life they had already begun to step into. We did not follow. We did not speak. We simply watched as they exited the building together, disappearing through the glass doors into the bright morning light outside. The moment stretched for a few seconds longer after they were gone, as if the space they left behind needed time to settle. Then Emily exhaled slowly, the sound controlled, steady. That is it, she said. I nodded once. Yes, I replied. There was no anger in my voice. No raised emotion. Just certainty. Because this was no longer a question. It was no longer a theory or a suspicion or a possibility. It was fact. And facts do not need to be argued. Emily looked down at her hands for a moment, then back up, her expression unchanged, but something deeper had shifted, something that moved from knowing into acceptance. He planned all of it, she said. The report, the timing, everything. Yes, I said again. We sat there for a moment longer, the quiet of the lobby returning to its usual rhythm, people passing by, unaware of what had just unfolded in that space. Then I stood up slowly, smoothing my jacket with a small, deliberate movement. We have seen what we needed to see, I said. Emily nodded, standing as well. What happens now? She asked. I looked toward the doors where Daniel had just walked out, where the life he thought he had secured was already moving forward without interruption. Now, I said calmly, we let him believe that nothing has changed. Emily studied me for a moment, then gave a small, understanding nod. Because she knew, just as I did, that the most powerful moment was not the discovery. It was what came after, when the truth existed quietly, waiting to be revealed at exactly the right time. We did not speak much on the drive back, and that silence was not empty. It was complete, because there was nothing left to question, nothing left to interpret, only something to accept, and then decide what to do with it. And when I stepped back into the house later that afternoon, everything looked exactly the same as it had that morning. The same chair, the same light across the floor, the same quiet stillness, but I was not the same person who had left it a few hours earlier. I placed my keys in the bowl by the door and moved into the kitchen, setting a pot of water on the stove, not because I was hungry, but because routine keeps the mind steady, and steadiness was what I needed now. My phone remained on the table, silent, and I did not reach for it, because there was nothing left to confirm, nothing left to discover. We had seen everything. By the time Daniel returned that evening, I was sitting at the table with a book open in front of me, the same way I had done countless times before, and when he walked in, he looked exactly as he always did, composed, calm, carrying himself with the quiet confidence of someone who believed his path was clear. "Trip went well," he said, placing his bag down. I looked up, offering a small nod. "I am glad to hear that," I replied. He moved through the kitchen, pouring himself a glass of water, his movements unhurried, natural, as if nothing in his world had shifted. "It was productive," he added. I watched him for a moment, noting the ease in his posture, the absence of tension, and I realized that this was the moment where everything I knew could change the direction of what came next. I could say it. I could tell him exactly what I had seen, exactly what I knew, and force the truth into the open. But I did not. Instead, I closed the book gently and set it aside. "That is good," I said simply. He seemed satisfied with that, with the lack of resistance, with the absence of questions, and he sat down across from me, the same way he had every night, the same distance between us, the same familiar setting that now held something entirely different beneath it. "I will be moving out next month," he said after a moment, his tone steady, as if he were discussing something already decided. I nodded once. "I assumed as much," I replied. He looked at me, perhaps expecting something more, some reaction, some indication that I would challenge him, but I did not give it. "I think it is best," he continued. For everyone. For everyone." The words settled into the space between us, carrying the same quiet finality they had before. "And Emily?" I asked, my voice calm, neutral. He hesitated, just for a second, then shrugged slightly. "She will figure things out," he said. I held his gaze, not with anger, not with accusation, but with something steadier, something that did not need to be spoken to be understood. "She already has," I said quietly. He frowned slightly, a small shift in his expression, the first sign of uncertainty I had seen in him since all of this began. "What do you mean?" he asked. I reached for my glass of water, taking a slow sip, giving the moment just enough space to settle before I answered. "I mean that life has a way of continuing, even when people try to control it," I said. He studied me for a moment, searching for something beneath my words, something he could hold on to, something he could understand, but there was nothing there for him to grasp, because I was no longer speaking in a way that required explanation. "I'm not sure what you were getting at," he said. I set the glass down carefully, aligning it with the edge of the table, my movements precise, controlled. "You do not need to be," I replied. Silence followed, not uncomfortable, but deliberate, the kind that allows truth to exist without being forced into the open. He looked away first, his attention shifting to the table, to anything that did not require him to meet my eyes. "I did what I thought was right," he said after a moment. I nodded slowly. "I know you did," I said. And that was true. He had done exactly what he believed would serve him best, exactly what he thought would give him control over the outcome, over the timing, over the narrative. But control is only as strong as the truth it is built on, and his had already begun to unravel. We sat there for a few moments longer, the conversation reaching its natural end without needing to be pushed further, and then he stood, gathering his things, moving toward the hallway. "Good night, Mom," he said. "Good night, Daniel," I replied. I listened as his door closed, the sound soft, final, and then the house returned to its quiet state, but it no longer felt like something waiting to be filled. It felt complete. I remained at the table for a while, my hands resting lightly in front of me, my thoughts steady, clear, not scattered the way they had been at the beginning. Because this was not about confronting him. It was not about forcing him to admit what he had done or making him understand the consequences in that moment. It was about something else entirely. It was about knowing. And once you know, you do not need to argue. You do not need to prove anything. You simply decide where you stand. I stood up slowly and turned off the lights, the room settling into darkness with a quiet finality, and as I walked toward my bedroom, I realized that the life I had thought I understood, the family I had believed in, had changed in a way that could not be reversed. But that did not mean I had lost anything. It meant I had seen clearly. And clarity, once it arrives, does not leave. The next morning, the house would still be here, the routines would still exist, and Daniel would continue forward on the path he had chosen, believing that everything was exactly as he had planned. But he was wrong, because there was one thing he had not accounted for, one thing he had underestimated from the very beginning. He thought he had control over the story, but he forgot that I was still here, and I had already seen the ending.